Hello everyone, my name is Jim Condit Jr., that's C-O-N-D-I-T, born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio, 50 years old now, went to St. Margaret of Cortona grade schools, St. Xavier High School, Xavier University, majored in Latin and Greek, ran a printing business from 1974 to 74 to 89, went into political and educational things, ran for city council many times in the 80s in Cincinnati, got involved in the vote fraud issue, put out a magazine called All These Things, and I'm simply going to put up a few of these. We only published 7 times in the last 10 years. It's now, we're making this tape on April 8th, 2003. We published in June 1990. We published again in July of 1990. Then we came out in September of 1991. Didn't publish again until the fall of 1998. There's Father Fahey, who we base our political philosophy on. Published again in May of 1999. Published again in... I'm sorry, there was January of 1999 is this one, then May of 1999. And then we published our last issue in November of 1999. Now, we did a special here on a book that was about to come out by Colonel Don Grand Prix, who was the head arms dealer under the Carter administration, or one of them. And we got a call. Now, even though I've only published those 7 times, I've met many of the best people in the country because of those issues floating around. And one of them called me sometime in 1998 after we began publishing All These Things again and said, Jim, I have nothing but the gold for you. I have some research. I don't know if anyone else will put it out. And the reason is because I don't know whether this tape will make more angry the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith or the Aryan Nations. It'll be a contest to see who is more fuming furious when they see that the information on this tape is being put out. I really don't know who will be madder, but they'll both be hopping mad because it destroys the historical official story about Adolf Hitler. We might call this tape The Final Solution to Adolf Hitler, the video. God willing, there'll be a book out. But if there's not a book, the reason we're making this tape is I want to point some young researchers in the right direction, and feel free to beat me to the punch to get this research out. Now, this gentleman, Ratisbone, who is our expert on European affairs, sent me the information for this article, which appeared in the November 1999 issue. It should be called the Rokovsky Interrogation in the Beginning of World War II. We'll get into that some, but that is just the beginning of it. He told me that this book here, which appeared exactly when, I don't know, because he may have seen a pre-copy of it, First printing was 2000. He saw a pre-copy of this book. Barbarians Inside the Gates by Colonel Don de Grand Prix. Again, he was the head arms dealer under Jimmy Carter to the Mideast. Realized something was going wrong. Excellent, excellent book. But Ratisbonne was tipped off by Chapter 7 of this book, The Nazi-Zionist Secret Alliance. And it has three, it starts on page 129 of the book, has three subheadings: Adolf Hitler, co-founder of Israel, the transfer agreement, and a new transfer agreement. That chapter tipped off the fellow who contacted me with this research, that there was something more than met the eye to the World War II era, and that's what this tape is about. Here's a pamphlet from 1940, and we cut off the copy here a little bit, but it's Hitler's policy is a Jewish policy, and it was written by P.R. Masson, M-A-S-S-O-N, and Borge Jensen, which you can see there. And it's some back and forth letters to a Jewish publicist. Here's some of the things. I'm going to read you here now quickly some of the things they say here, which is kind of interesting. It says, most Englishmen, they're writing now to a Jewish publicist over the Hitler matter. Now, this is 1940. Most Englishmen have a reasonable sense of fair play, and that includes a repugnance to cruelty of an unreasonable nature. Many of us believe that Hitler's anti-Semitism is merely a blind to cover the fact that he has received powerful support from highly placed financial interests. And then he goes into the fact that these are, in some cases, Jewish interests. He says the following names should be scrutinized a little further down: Rothschild, Meyer, Baruch, Schuster, Warburg, Kuhn, Guggenheim, Nehmeyer, Schiff, Sief, S-I-E-F-F. These are the names of men or families who move along in the shadows behind governments and wield enormous influence almost unknown to the general public. A little further on, he says, Hitler has said many things against Jewish domination, but I maintain that the sum total of his actions contradict all he has said. In all probability, he is the most potent agent through which the leaders of world Jewry are carrying out their final attempt of world domination. This statement requires some explanation. Now, this is written in 1940. Hitler's anti-Semitism, he says on the next page, is merely a blind or like a distraction. You say that in this connection, I ignore the Nazi ideology of blood and race, of which anti-Semitism is but a part. Now, it should be remembered that Hitler is not the only person who attaches importance to blood. None have been more interested and laid more stress on the importance of blood in its social aspect than the Jews themselves. Hitler's blood theories have resulted in his Nuremberg laws, which are but the transplantation onto Gentile soil of those marital laws to which the Orthodox Jew attaches so much importance. In other words, he's saying that Hitler has brought to a non-Jewish country the laws that the Orthodox Jews have always felt were important. Hitler's Jew laws are, as you know, it might be more proper to say his anti-Jew laws, because you remember Nuremberg made it illegal for Germans and Jews to marry. Hitler's Jew laws are, as you know, the only original addition to a program of aggrandizement and centralization of power which he has taken over direct from Bismarck and Wilhelm. Both these gentlemen in Germany were constantly surrounded by Jewish advisors, and all the German Reich constitutions have been framed by Jews. Mr. Roth, a co-religionist of yours, writes on it, and he goes on. Now, this is just a few paragraphs from this 40-page long pamphlet. What I was told by Ratisbonne was, look, Hitler's just following a program that has been foisted on Germany since the time of Bismarck, who is made so much of in the history books. And what he was basically saying here was that basically, well, here's what was happening, in my judgment. And this is what we'll put evidence after evidence in this tape on. Hitler was funded to power, and we'll get into some of the sources of this, partially by Jewish interests, maybe largely by Jewish interests. And his part of the deal was to begin screaming bloody murder against the Jews from the time he went to power. Now, he may have believed this in 90%, 95%. Surely he believed it to a large extent. But his part of the deal was to scream bloody murder against the Jews and shut down, basically start to round up the Jews. And the thing that has not been known until recently is that part of the deal was to get as many Jews as he possibly could down to Israel, to help the Zionists get as many Jews as they could down to Palestine at that time in preparation for the invasion and takeover of Palestine, which happened in 1948. And that brings us right to the present day, because the founding of Israel leads into all the tensions that we're fighting in the Iraq War that's still going on right now as I do this tape. So this is relevant right to today. Now, before I go on here, people might be saying, "Oh, this is unbelievable. This is ridiculous. This is the most absurd thing I've ever heard. It's so against what most of us have always heard." Take a look at this. This came today. It's dated April 14th, 6 days ahead of where we are now, April 8th, 2003, from the American Free Press. The head article is "Iraq Wrecked, Iran Next." Okay? Let me read you just the first two paragraphs. The Bush administration, in what is unethically called an off-the-record session, strongly implied that the United States would invade Iran once the fighting ends in Iraq. A 3-day session of the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, which ended April 1 in Washington, Israeli Political Affairs Committee, that's AIPAC, was attended by about 5,000 advocates of Israel First policies, including half the United States Senate and 1/3 of the United States House. Do most people in America know this? No. Are the talk shows preventing people from knowing it or not talking about this type of thing? Yes. So 99% or 95% of the American people don't know that we're in Iraq right now because of the Jewish lobby, the Zionist Jewish lobby specifically, because there's many Jews that oppose it. The Zionist Jewish lobby, as represented by AIPAC, won us there. And then they say that a Bush administration official named John Bolton stopped short of saying that we would invade Iran after Iraq, but knowing the absurdity of such an off-the-record comment and demand in a session like this. But he did say that we would make it a high priority, extremely high priority, on halting a secret nuclear weapons program in Iran as soon as we get Iraq under control. Now, what's my point? 99% of the American people don't know that what's driving us is the Zionist Jewish lobby into these wars in the Middle East, and I feel confident they're going to try to drive us into another war. So let's not be shocked that maybe myself until recently, and maybe many watching this tape, are not aware of this information, because back then there was not the internet and there was not the ability to get this information out, which is now coming out in the last few decades from all kinds of sources. Exhibit 2, Hitler's Jewish Soldiers. A new book out. You can get it from the University of Press of Kansas. Any of these things, you could go onto Google, google.com. That's a search engine. Type in the keywords and it'll bring things up. Brian Mark Rigg. It's called Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, The Untold Story of Nazi Racial Laws and Men of Jewish Descent in the Nazi Army. Untold Story of Nazi Racial Laws and Men of Jewish Descent in Hitler's Army. I think it's cut off over here. You can get that book and you can see for yourself. Here's a picture of Brian Mark Rigg. He was a researcher in Oxford who, from Texas, who began to stumble on this and eventually compiled this book. There's some controversy about the book, but I won't go into that, or the tape will get too long if we go into too many nuances. But the question is, what was his motive? Was it to expose something that was going to come out anyway, or was it just honest research all the way? In any case, it's accurate research. Here's an article from the Los Angeles Jewish Times of 1997. Hitler's Jewish soldiers were no secret. Well, they were to everybody till this book came out. Remember, the official line is that Hitler was trying to exterminate every Jew in the world, right? Here's another article from the Daily Telegraph, Monday, December 2nd, 1996, from England. Fatherland's honor for hated race. And they list here 3 pictures. Here's Helmut Schmidt, background hidden in the Luftwaffe. Here is an officer and a Jew. Helmut Wilberg was an architect of the concept of blitzkrieg, while Edgar Jacobson was a propaganda maker, given the Iron Cross First Class. Now, Ratisbone tells me that when the research is in, all of the key Nazis, or 98% of them, will be proven to be half Jewish, part Jewish, including Hitler himself, which we'll get to a little further on the tape. And then we got another article here from the Daily Telegraph, which is the same article. And there we see Jews who wore a Nazi uniform. While these soldiers served in the German army, many of their Jewish relatives were murdered in concentration camps. So, and then they have down here, student's trip to Berlin cinema gave him the story of a lifetime. There's Brian Rigg, a little younger, 1996 or so. And then he ran into some Jewish soldiers who had been in Hitler's army, and then he eventually got 30,000 papers, and this book came out, which anybody can get. Now, how does this fit with the official story of what we've been told? Not too well, I would say. How does we explain that Hitler, and what it came out in the book is that there were I hope I got my numbers right here, 150,000 soldiers who were part Jewish in Hitler's army, 1,100 plus officers, 79 high-level officers, and 9 generals who were part Jewish. That's from the research in Hitler's Jewish Soldiers by Brian Mark Rigg. And yet Hitler was trying to kill every Jew in the world? How does that fit? Another thing I found out, incidentally, one other documentation here. Doug Collins, who passed away a year or so ago, in his book Here We Go Again, refers to some of this research by Brian Mark Rigg. So there's another source for you on that subject. Okay, now, I knew a fact since 1976 that Franklin Roosevelt had closed the United States border to Jewish immigration when he came to power in 1933. Hitler and Roosevelt came to power in the same month, March 1933. I didn't know what to make of that. Why not? I had read years later, I had read the eulogies that came out of the Jewish community, and you would think with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, they were talking about the second coming of the Savior. I mean, it was so complimentary. Why would FDR close the borders of the United States to Jews the best he could? Some got in, but he closed the borders, making it very difficult for Jews to come from Germany and Europe to the United States the same month that Hitler came to power. Well, what I'm going to tell you is the reason is world Zionism and the World Permanent Revolution, the Bush faction, if you will, the Freemasonic Anglo faction that works with world Zionism for many generations now. The plan was this. Hitler is funded to power for several reasons. He screams bloody murder from day one against the Jews. Starts to round them up. Franklin Roosevelt closes the border in the United States. So the point is that when Hitler begins to let some of the Jews out, then they only have one place to go. And that is, there's only one place they can easily go to, and that is to Palestine. That's the meaning of Franklin Roosevelt closing the borders. The explanation given is, anti-Semitism was sweeping the United States too. Let's talk about this book that just came out recently, IBM and the Holocaust. Excuse me, we're going to keep moving the documentation along here. IBM and the Holocaust, I believe, came out in 1999. By Jewish scholar Edwin Black. It's called The Strategic Alliance Between Nazi Germany and America's Most Powerful Corporation. It also comes with a set of tapes, audio tapes, in which I think if you listen, you'll see that the historian is also quite an actor for some of the things he tries to pull over. His facts are on target, but you got to read between the lines once you know the information I'm giving you here. Because he paints Thomas Watson of IBM as like the most evil guy in the history of the world. He wants you to believe that IBM was Watson of IBM was a big anti-Semite, went over to Germany, and started to help. This is 1933, the very month, March 1933, the very month Hitler comes to power. Thomas Watson lands in with IBM in Germany and starts helping Hitler catalog every Jew in Germany on IBM punch cards. That's what this book is about. That's what IBM and the Holocaust is about, is they were there to help Hitler catalog every Jew in Germany. Now, we're supposed to believe that the Germans were demanding, hey, we can't stand these Jews, somebody identify them and round them up. But that was not what was happening. People that were in Germany at that time will tell you they noticed the Jews started to be rounded up, but they were not demanding it. The common people who were not demanding it before Hitler came to power and started screaming about it. Of course, the Germans wanted their country to be raised because they had been humiliated by the Versailles Treaty. But what was happening, I will submit to you, is that the top Jewish financiers, the Rothschilds, had lost control of the Jewish people, and they needed to round them back up and get control over them so they could get a lot of them to move where they did not want to move, which was down to the Middle East and Palestine to fight the Arabs in the sands for the rest of their life. They didn't want to go there, and they needed a way to make them go there, and I'm telling you on this tape that the financing of Hitler and IBM landing to help Hitler. Keep in mind, the New York Times through all this time is right there in New York City with thousands of Jewish informants around IBM. Never run anything about this. No news. No news of significance. And Watson, as he documents in here, goes back and forth to Germany dozens of times getting awards and helping Hitler because it wasn't, so there may have been Germans who didn't like the Jews present. I don't know. I'm sure there were. But the impetus, the organization, the motivation, the financing came from the Jews who needed to get back control of the Jewish people to go down to Israel. Now, there's a Jewish author named Israel Shahak. Perhaps some of you have heard of him. And he wrote this book called Open Secrets, but he wrote another book called Jewish History and Jewish Religion. This book is Open Secrets, but his other book that you want to get for this study is Jewish History, Jewish Religion. Israel Shahak died at 85 years old a few months ago, maybe a year ago in Israel. He was a renegade from the Zionist establishment. Israel Shahak tells us that in the Middle Ages the rabbis kept close tabs on and exploited the Jewish people in the ghetto. And what was happening with Zionism and Nazism in World War II was to get control of a people that were perhaps intermarrying too much, coexisting too well, shall we say, assimilating to some extent into the population. They wanted to stop this and to get back the Zionist plan to take over Israel again in the Middle East, to get that on track. Now, so Shahak goes into this. The way I've analogized it to people is like this. If somebody came to you and me and said, hey, we got a really good program going in Antarctica. It's really neat. We got building things. It's something you'll be in on the ground floor, and you and I might say, "Well, no, I have a family here, and I got my business, and blah. We got to keep doing this, that, and the other. I can't really go." Okay, now 6 months later, you and your family are rounded up, thrown in a concentration camp. Maybe along the way, somebody dies because of harsh treatment or whatever, not proper attention to disease or whatever the case may be in some cases. And now the same people come back to us and say, hey, now you've lost your home, you've lost all your possessions, you're in a concentration camp. Hey, now we still have that project in Antarctica. Would you and your family like to go? Then you might say, well, maybe I can fit it in now. Maybe I can make time. And that's what was happening. And tens of thousands of Jews then left Germany and went to Palestine, again in anticipation of the invasion of Palestine and the takeover of Palestine by Israel in 1948. How do we know some of that? Here's another source, very important. This is from the Journal of Palestine Studies. It's still available on the internet. You can find this group, and they published In 1976, an article called "The Secret Contacts, Zionist-Nazi Relations, 1933 to 1941" by Klaus Polkin. Okay, now this article tells about, for instance, the first ship that left. Well, let's say first this. Hitler, when he came to power in Germany, closed down every Jewish paper right away and threw the leaders most of the time in jail, except one. He left the Zionist paper open. The Zionists weren't making any traction. They had their Antarctica project. Nobody wanted to go. Nobody wanted to leave civilized Europe and go down in the hot sands to fight the Arabs for the rest of their life. And Hitler then suddenly, when Hitler's threatening the Jews in Germany, suddenly the Zionists, their fortunes go way up. One of the other things that Klaus Polkin tells us about in that article is that the first ship, for instance, that brought Jews from Nazi Germany to Israel, or to Palestine at that time, left Germany with a Nazi commander, and on the ship was the swastika, and on the side of the ship were, in Hebrew, Tel Aviv, I believe, something like that. It was a Hebrew saying on the side of the ship, inscribed in Hebrew, Nazi flag, and they all, the first group went down out of Nazi Germany to Palestine based on what was happening behind the scenes, unbeknownst to the whole world. So what I am suggesting in this tape is that Nazism and Zionism are two sides of the same program, kind of like the Democrats and Republicans, except people were getting killed and rounded up and a lot more serious than we have going on in America. But they were basically two sides of the same program. And Klaus Polkin's article is extremely significant in this regard. Now, okay, now I'm going to read you something from The Secret Contacts, Zionism and Nazi Germany, 1933 to 1941, which is what for some reason, that's on the inside of the magazine, which is a little different than what they have on the outside. Klaus Polkin again. And here's the beginning of the article. Anti-Semitism became official German government policy when Hitler was named Chancellor of the German Reich on January 30th, 1933. The spring of 1933 also witnessed the beginning of a period of private cooperation between Zionism and the German fascist regime to increase the inflow of German Jewish immigrants in capital to Palestine. The Zionist authorities succeeded in keeping this cooperation a secret for a long period, and only since the beginning of the 1960s have criticism of it been expressed here and there. The Zionist reaction has usually consisted of declarations that their one-time contacts with Nazi Germany were undertaken solely to save the lives of Jews. But the contacts were all the more remarkable because they took place at a time when many Jews and Jewish organizations demanded a boycott of Nazi Germany. Now, this is very important. On the occasion of the 16th convention of the Israeli Communist Party, a paper was submitted at the outset of the conference in which it was stated that, quote, after Hitler's taking of power in Germany, when all anti-fascist forces in the world and the great majority of the Jewish organizations proclaimed a boycott against Nazi Germany, contacts and collaboration between Zionist leaders and the Hitler existed between Zionist leaders and the Hitlerite government. And then they go on from there. If you think these little things I'm reading are bombshells, you should see the whole article. Let me read another part here. In connection with, now when Hitler came to power that month also, Samuel Untermeyer in New York City called for a worldwide boycott of Jewish goods. And anybody out there that wants to defend Hitler, here's the question I want to pose to you. Here's Samuel Untermeyer, worldwide boycott, Jewish boycott of German goods because Hitler's so anti-Jewish. Well, this is from Klaus Polkin article, page 65, that 1976 edition of the Institute for Palestine Studies magazine. In connection with the emigration to Palestine that had been caused by the Havre Agreement, the Zionists established their own Palestine shipping company, which brought the German passenger ship Hohenstein and renamed it Tel Aviv. Well, this is what I told you about before. This ship embarked on its first trip from the German port of Bremerhaven to Haifa at the beginning of 1935. On this trip, the ship bore on its stern the Hebrew letters of the new name Tel Aviv, while from the mast fluttered the swastika. A combination of metaphysical absurdity, wrote one of the passengers later. The captain of the ship, Leedy, was a registered member of the Nazi Party. Not so absurd as that passenger thought. Many of the everyday Jews were caught in this whipsaw. The Havre Agreement was, in effect, what is called the transfer agreement. Again, I could spend the rest of the tape reading you bombshells out of this article by Klaus Polking. Most of this information has come from socialist-leaning Jews in the last 40 years who were mad as heck that what happened to their people, basically, when Hitler rounded them up. So let's move to, what I'm going to now give you some solid documentation to look at regarding the transfer agreement, which is, while this boycott was called by Samuel Untermeyer, Hitler concluded an agreement with the Zionist company Havre, H-A-V-A-R-A, I think it was, and they shipped a lot of German goods through this Havre company, and then they were resold to other companies. So in effect, the German goods were being sold at 70% of retail. The Havre company was marking it up to 30%, and the Zionists made tens of billions of dollars through this transfer agreement in preparation to prepare for the takeover of Palestine. Excuse me here, we are having a... Okay, so let's not rely just on Klaus Polking's 40-page article in the Institute for Palestine Studies. Let's go to a book, a full-length book, 1984, The Transfer Agreement by Jewish scholar Edmund Black. Remember, he was the same guy that wrote IBM and the Holocaust 14 years later. The untold story of the secret agreement between the Third Reich and Jewish Palestine. What this tells about is how the goods were transferred down through this transfer agreement company, Havre. Some of it sold to other countries to, quote, break the German boycott. Now, here's my question to people who want to say, oh, no, Hitler just wanted to, he just wanted the Jews out of Germany. The Zionists wanted the Jews out of Germany to get them down to Israel. So this was a marriage made in heaven, in effect, for both sides. Well, did Hitler ever complain in a public speech about the transfer agreement? And I'm saying I believe at this point he did not. Maybe somebody can prove me wrong. He did not explain it to the German people, and he did not complain about it because he was in a deal with the Rothschilds and the Warburgs and those who funded him to the top. That was the deal. Now, Hitler may have wanted the Jews out of Germany, but he did not complain about this. And secondly, if you were really an anti-Semite, if that was your main modus operandi, why would you cooperate with the Jews to take over the one area of the world they wanted, namely Israel? Why not say, well, you're going to go to like some people were talking about, the island of Madagascar, which would have been probably cruel and unusual punishment, or to South Florida, to work out something where the Jews would be safe, where they wouldn't have to worry about anybody attacking them, or they'd be welcome like they are in the United States of America. Why cooperate to take over the one part of the world where the Jews want so they can try to prove that Christ never came as Savior and that they really belong there all along, and secondly, to where there's just going to be endless fighting between the Arabs and everybody, and the Jews and everybody else now. So that's a challenge I have to people that want to say, oh, no, Hitler was, he was what he appeared to be, just a super German patriot, and everything was as we've been told, pro or con. Now, again, back in when Hitler started this roundup, guess who was helping to round up a lot of the Orthodox Jews and Jews in Germany? I know a lady who was in Germany. She says yes. We noticed that Jews began to disappear and be rounded up. Well, in the book by Rabbi Schoenfeld, "The Holocaust Victims Accused." This is put out by Jews who are against Zionism, and I'm going to explain what that is briefly and give you a website. this is a book I got used, and it's a little cut off up here. And it was written by Reb, which is what some of the Jews call their rabbis, Reb Moise Schoenfeld, and he is documents and testimony on Jewish war criminals. He testifies that Jewish police helped Hitler round up Jews to put in the camps. Why? Because the Zionists were happy to be rounding them up and didn't care if they betrayed and had a lot of the everyday Jews killed. You see. Now, all Jews, this is a little tough in this tape to get into everything about the theological and historical backgrounds, but when people talk about Jews and the Jews talk about Jews, you could be talking about them under the auspices of a race, which is a very confused thing. Some people say there is no Jewish race, but under race, under culture or ethnic group, or under a nation, you might say, or a religion, I should say. Actually, a religion was way before there was a nation of Israel. So some people could say religion, but when you talk about Jews, Zionist Jews, they're the Jews who wanted to have a homeland reestablished in Israel. There are Jews who are absolutely opposed to this. That's where I got this book. The Holocaust Victims Accused by Rabbi Schoenfeld is from a group in New York City, and you can go to their website, which is JewsNotZionist.org. That's easy to remember. Jews, not one word, that's spelled as one word. JewsNotZionist.org. Go there, you can see this and a lot of other stuff. And they have another group called New Karta, something else that's a different group that they cooperate with. These are anti-Zionist Jews who still believe in the Jewish religion, but believe it is an outrage to try to establish Israel before their Messiah comes, which we Christians would say Messiah already came, and you missed the boat, and that's why everything's in such a confusion. But they are looking for their Messiah still. But they're telling the Sharon and the Zionists in Israel, you're going to create untold suffering for us in the world if you don't cut this out. So there are Jews who are against Zionism. I would hope that a lot of everyday Jews seeing this would say, gee, this is important information. We need to relook at this and would be grateful that we're trying to bring this information out, some of this information many Jews may know. I don't know if that'll happen or not, but that's what I would like to think would happen, because the one legacy of World War II is the everyday Jews, everyday Germans, everyday Poles were all victimized by the machinations of some super criminals, which used Hitler, Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt as the front super criminals. We'll get into that a little more later. Okay, now let's move along to Hitler's Jewish connection. We're going to get into a lot more documentation, but was Hitler Jewish? Here's a book that came out in the 30s. I just have a copy of it here, but it's called Hitler's Youth by Franz Jetzinger. In here, he does the family tree of Hitler. Here's a picture of Hitler as a youth that might be a self-portrait, not sure. And he goes into Hitler's genealogy, and he did some tremendous research showing that there was, whenever anyone went into Hitler's genealogy, they, excuse me, I'm looking for the chart, which may not be that helpful, but maybe I'm not going to find, there it is. That it often came out that Hitler's grandfather of his dad, his grandfather, was very mysterious, and the evidence pointed to his grandfather being a Jewish banker. This book came out in the 30s, and he goes through the whole family tree. Ratisbone, my source for much of this information, or very much of it, tells me that he believes that when the research is finally done, because Hitler did a lot to destroy the genealogical records in his birthplace, which was Brunau on the Inn in Germany, he believes that his mother, Clara Pohlz, P-O-H-L-Z, or P-O-H-Z-L, and there's different spellings of it, but Clara Pohlz, that her side of her family will be proved to be Jewish too, in part. So this was, just want to mention this as a source. People can get it and read it themselves if they wish. It's available, but this came out in the 30s. Another book came out in 1964, and this book was called, and it's still in Germany. If we got any enterprising people that know German that would be willing to translate this into English, came out in 1964, Bever Hitler come. It's still in Germany. It means before Hitler come, or before Hitler came. Written by a Jewish school teacher in Germany in 1964 called Dietrich Bronder. He says what Ratisbonne told me, that many of the high officials in Nazism were part Jewish, that they worked together with the Zionists, that they persecuted the everyday Jews with the Zionists. This book was quickly suppressed. It was never brought into English. We need to have this book in English, or we need someone who reads German to read it and give a more complete history of it than we have been able to get to this point. But here's another book that is just big book, hundreds of pages, bombshell after bombshell, I'm sure. Now, we got a book recently. People might say, gee, is he just, if you only had 2 facts, you might say, well, something else might be happening here. But when you have fact after fact after fact, here's a book that came out in 1999, available everywhere, called Hitler's Vienna, A Dictator's Apprentice by Bridget Heyman. Now I'm going to read you a few things from Bridget Heyman's book, Hitler's Vienna, because it deals with Hitler and was Hitler Jewish. It refers, first of all, to a book by Hitler's lawyer for much of the Third Reich, or a pamphlet, actually. And this guy's name was Hans Frank. Hans Frank, F-R-A-N-K. Hans Frank was half Jewish. This is Hitler's lawyer through the Third Reich. Now, as we're going to see, a nasty fight broke out between the world powers, which everyone knows, called World War II. And Hans Frank was hung at Nuremberg, as many of the Nazis were, because of there was such a animosity going between the factions at that point. And incidentally, I should mention here, we need to, I thought I made this clear, but I want to make sure that I made it clear. Just as we're not talking about the average German who joined the Nazi Party, we're talking about the Nazis, the top Nazis, Hitler and the boys. We're not talking about the average Zionist Jew in the world then or now who wants a homeland. We're talking about the top Zionists who were cooperating with the Nazis, which is probably less than 0.1%. Now, I have theological objections to the way Israel has been founded and developed, and I'll mention that briefly, although that's not the main focus of this tape, through referring to the books to Father Fahey. But we're talking here about that minute element of super criminals who were cooperating with each other on all sides. Well, anyway, Hans Frank was Hitler's personal attorney. Half Jewish. He was the former governor general in Poland. And he made, according to Bridget Heyman on page 48 and 49, his last pamphlet, Make Truly Explosive Material Public. Shortly before he was executed, so this is kind of like a deathbed confession, he wrote his memoirs, and then she gives it in German, Im Angesicht des Galgens. I probably butchered that, meaning facing the gallows, or it's often printed as in the face of the gallows. Hans Frank, where he mentioned that the following bona fide scoop. At the end of 1930, he wrote Hitler had shown him a letter commenting that this was a disgusting blackmail story of one of his most repulsive relatives concerning Hitler's ancestry, unquote. The relative had dropped hints to the effect that, quote, in connection with certain remarks in the press, one would be well advised not to broadcast certain circumstances of our family history, unquote. Bridget Heyman goes on to say the point was that, quote, Hitler had Jewish blood in his veins and therefore had scant credentials for being anti-Semitic, unquote. We'll get into this. This was William Patrick Hitler who was blackmailing the Fuhrer, and we'll get into that. Frank claimed that after Hitler directed him to check confidentially into the matter, he found out, quote, from all kinds of sources, unquote, which he did not want to divulge, the following, quote, before the child was born, Hitler's grandmother Schnickelgruber had been a cook in Graz in the household of a Jew by the name of Frankenberger, that she had become pregnant by the son of the house, and that for the next 14 years she received child support payments for little Aloy, that's Hitler's father. There had been a, quote, correspondence between the Frankenbergers and Hitler's grandmother, which went on for years, and whose basic thrust it was that everyone had tacitly acknowledged that Schnickelgruber's illegitimate child was born under circumstances that obliged Frankenberger to pay child support. Frankenberger, again, being a Jewish banker. Now that's the end of the quote. According to his own racial laws, Hitler thus would have been a, quote, quarter Jew and not been able to produce the necessary ticket into the Third Reich, quote, the proof of Aryan descent. Frank was conspicuously ambiguous in leaving the impression that he did not find this theory implausible. And then she goes on from there, and you can read the whole thing. But Frank says in other parts of the pamphlet that when he went down to Hitler's birthplace to see what investigators could find out, that he found out that Hitler was Hitler, from a number of sources, that Hitler's birth certificate and so forth indicated that this was his ancestry. Although, again, I've given you the name of the pamphlet in the face of the gallows, so someone can check it out in case I've slightly misstated a nuance here. Now, Hitler, as you remember, when he went into Austria, incidentally, went down and bulldozed the graveyards down there in near his birthplace in Brunau on the Inn, and destroyed the records. And as Ratisbonne said, when we find somebody who's under the microscope destroying evidence, we usually call him guilty. Now, by that I don't mean that guilty is someone who would be Jewish is guilty, but Hitler, in trying to be the head anti-Semite in the world, trying to cover up, it looks like he's trying to cover up some facts. Now, we also go on to here, I want to read one other part from Bridget Heyman here, and this has to do with what she found out in some of her other researches, which I think is quite incredible here. And this is about the time that Hitler was being raised to power in 1933. She says, now scores of reporters started searching for Hitler's alleged Jewish relatives. It was discovered that the name Hitler appeared among Jewish families in the small town of Polna in Moravia in Poland, and that there was a Jewish merchant in the Liebstadt district who claimed to be a relative of Hitler via Polna. In Warsaw, some Jewish families by the name of Hitler officially applied for a change of name, adverting to the anti-Semitic German politician. This is on page 46 of Hitler's Vienna by Bridget Heyman. The summer of 1933, this is when Hitler had just come to power, brought new headlines. Lidovo Novini in Prague reported on July 6th that in Polna, people were mentioning an Abraham Hitler from the 18th century as Hitler's ancestor. Deutsch Freihardt of Saarbrücken wrote on July 6, quote, the Jewish Hitler family, with sources. Österreichisches Morgenblatt, as I say, I'm probably butchering these, wrote on July 13th, quote, Brown Hitler and his yellow spot. I guess it was kind of a play on words of the Brown Church or something. Vorarlberger Wacht wrote, quote, so he did have a Jewish grandmother after all, Mr. Hitler. No, referring to Mr. Hitler. And she gives sources for all these. In the meantime, Bekessi had become an editor for Österreichisches Abendblatt and published new revelations starting on July 12, 1933. For example, on July 14, 1933, quote, awesome traces of the Hitler Jews in Vienna was the subject, with photographs from Hitler graves in the Jewish section of Vienna's Central Cemetery. In other words, gravestones that said Hitler on them, of Hitlers who had died. And a cookbook by one Rosalie Hitler written in Hebrew. On July 19th, Bekassi's newspaper even printed the headline, Hitler's Jewishness officially confirmed. This time the newspaper published the pedigree of a Jewish Heidler family in Polna. And she goes on, and I would say that she makes the case that that headline was exaggerated there slightly. What I'm pointing out to you, though, is all the different arrows pointing in the same direction here. So at any rate, and it says in a footnote that Brown Hitler was a play on the Brown Church. So this is just, again, a part of what she repeated. But these Hitler revelations of being Jewish were all over small papers in Germany and other countries at that time. So there's, again, here's a whole book. This is an establishment historian, and she's not trying to make the case that I'm making, but that's evidence she puts in her book in trying to put the rest, this idea that Hitler was part Jewish. Okay, now, Nord Davis, who has now passed away in the 1980s, came out with a series called Star Wars, and it was actually his books that first, I'll put up there were several versions that came out. This was the earlier version, you might be able to tell. But he came out with a ton of documentation. It was really a ton of documentation. And a lot of the books that we have here, he somehow found, and that you're going to see. We'll get back to the Star Wars later in some of the revelations that Nord Davis makes. Now, let's move on to another source regarding Hitler. Let's put these two things up here. There's a book that came out last year. I believe it was in 2001. No, it came out in January 2000. Time flies and I lose track of time. This book was called The Last of the Hitlers. Just came out, written by a fellow named David Gardner, Gardner. Again, if you go to google.com on the internet, put in some of these keywords like Last of the Hitlers, David Gardner, and stuff will come up all over the joint. And he has a whole chapter in this book called "Was Hitler Jewish?" Now, I kind of think that the publisher messed with his book, because when you read that chapter, you kind of go through and you say, "Gee, did the author forget what he was writing about?" It's like somebody took his information and jumbled it up so that it wasn't understandable. I'd like to get in touch with him to see if this is a good reason why, if you publish your own book, the researcher that I'm looking out there that might take this research much farther, publish it yourself. There's a process now called on-demand printing that IBM or many small printers do. You go publish your own book. You can publish 5 at a time once you scan the pages in. And that's the way to do it, so you don't have your chapters jumbled up. But the more revealing thing was, let's look at this thing here from CNN. There's David Gardner appearing on CNN with Paul Azan, and I want to read you a part of we'll leave that up there. I want to read you a part of the interview with David Gardner and Paul Azan. The interviews were more revealing from Paul Azan, and then I'm going to tell you one I have on tape that was done with Judith Regan of Fox, whose show used to be on at night. Here's part of the interview. Zahn says, tell us, this gets back to this blackmail of Hitler by William Patrick Hitler, part Irish Hitler. One of Hitler's relatives went and married an Irishman, and this William Patrick Hitler came out of this. Paul Zahn, CNN. Tell us a little bit about this blackmail letter that you learned of. Who had the letter and what did it tell us? So David Gardner, whose picture we had up on you just saw a minute ago, said, well, William Patrick Hitler, as I said, was working in Germany in the 30s, and he'd gone there hoping to benefit from his uncle's position. At that time, having a Hitler in Germany, there was a good chance he was going to get a good position. But he found out that he was kind of knocked around. He worked in a lowly bank job. He worked at a car factory, never really getting any decent money or any position. He sent a blackmail letter to Adolf, which, as you remember, Hans Frank's referred to, and in the face of the gallows, basically saying, if you don't give me a better job and treat me a little better, I'll go public with a speculation within the family that Hitler himself had a Jewish grandfather. Paul Zahn, whatever became of that threat? David Gardner. Well, in fact, Hitler kind of bowed down to it, this lowly nephew, and did give him some money. Which is kind of curious. I mean, of all the terrible things that Hitler did, the one person that stood up to him seems to have been his own nephew, and who went away with the equivalent now to $250,000. Zahn, let's talk about the reality of the lives of these nephews, and then she goes on to something else. Now, the Judith Regan interview on Fox, which I have on tape from around that time, is even better. In there, she says about this letter, she says, so Hitler paid this guy the equivalent of William Patrick Hitler, the equivalent of $250,000 to keep quiet about this Jewish ancestry thing. And Gardner says, yeah, and she says, so it was like a payoff? And Gardner says, yeah. Now, David Gardner isn't just some weird author. His previous book was a biography of Tom Hanks. So I think he got into areas here that he wasn't supposed to. This book, as far as I know, is still not available in America. You have to order it from England. I think he stumbled into some areas, and it was about the 3 last Hitlers that he could find who were living in New York City. I think a few of whom are still alive under a changed name. So anyway, there you have it. There's another bombshell book that's out recently, and you can go ahead and look it up for yourself. The big bombshell in that book, though, something that did come out in his chapter, was Hitler Jewish, and this is critical. Ratisbonne lays tremendous importance on this. There was a Catholic leader of Austria named Dollfuss, Dolfuss, who did not like the Nazis, and for good reason, and many reasons. And what Dollfuss, when Hitler came to power, like we're going to get into in a little bit, was, what's going on here? He had a government investigation into who Hitler was and where he came from. This is an Austrian government report. Now, a government has a lot of resources at its command. And the government report, the Austrian government report, concluded, among other things, that Hitler was the grandson of one of the Rothschild bankers. That's in the book Last of the Hitlers by David Gardner, that Hitler was the grandson of one of the Rothschild bankers. If you punch in, you'll find more stuff on this on the internet. That's an Austrian government report. The Nazis assassinated Dollfuss in 1935, and as I say, when Hitler went down into Austria, he destroyed all the graveyards and so forth around where he was born. So that I consider to be a very significant fact. Dollfuss was a good man, and this gets into, at least by many people's reckoning, this gets into something we'll get into later regarding what this centralization of Germany under Bismarck to Hitler was partially about. But we'll keep moving along right here. Now we have a book called Adolf Hitler, Founder of Israel, by Heinrich Cardell. That's C-A-R-D-E-L. Let me just take this down and throw this up here. And there's not the greatest, a lot of these books we have Xerox. This book now is available, though, I believe, on Amazon and a lot of other places. It didn't come out that long ago. Cardell's another socialist Jew from Germany, and he makes the point that after 2,000 years of certain Jews trying to get back to Israel, Hitler comes along, and 3 years after he disappears from the world scene, Israel's founded. And he makes the point that when you look at this whole thing, that Hitler was very instrumental, whatever Hitler's intentions were, in the founding of Israel. This book is full of stuff. A lot of it, I don't consider this book to be as rock solid in documentation by any means as some of the others that I'm mentioning here, but it's a lot of anecdotal stuff, and it is worth perusing. It's got some very interesting insights. Here's the way he begins this off, this Cardell. He says, in 1973, on an Atlantic island, the author ran across a staff officer with whom, and together with other men from a dozen European nations, he besieged Leningrad some 30 years earlier. This was 1973. At the outbreak of the First World War, his parents, Jews of Vienna, while on an oceanic voyage, were impounded and later settled on this island. After the first few drinks in a casino, having loosened their tongues, the author, that's Cardell, asked him, quote, "Amigo, being a full Jew, how can you wear these 3 medals and decorations with a swastika on your chest?" End quote. "Well," came back the answer in a beautiful Viennese jargon, "why don't you start scratching on Hitler yourself? Then you will see that a Vienna Jew like me will appear." Unquote. And he goes on from there. He has a lot of interesting things in this book. Let me go to a picture here, though, at that juncture, because he says this particular guy quoted. A lot of the stuff in this book, though, is anecdotal, but I think it's worth noting, and that Cardell's still alive and passionately defends his book from what I understand. Here's a picture of Hitler before he became Chancellor shaking the hands of Hindenburg, who was the previous head of Germany before Hitler. This is not a proof, but I see here this picture's famous. You can get it on the internet by going to google.com images and put in Hitler Hindenburg. I see here a body type that is definitely a Prussian man in Hindenburg. And over here, I might imagine that I see a little Sephardic Jew type of a person shaking hands with him. This is not a proof. Of course, some people said Hitler's mustache was to blunt the Jewish type nose that he had from being as prominent. These are not proofs, but I just present this picture to you. Otto Strasser, a rival of Hitler, who we'll get into later, said that Hitler was always very obsequious around Hindenburg when he was trying to, hoping to succeed him. So again, that isn't a proof, it's more of an anecdotal thing. But now, one of the other things that is in this book, and he quotes a number of anecdotes about it, is the idea that he quotes a Trebek Lincoln, a Jewish fellow who brought money to Hitler, he says at certain points, as saying, anti-Semitism is only valuable in the hands of us Jews. Now, he then documents that many of the anti-Semitic papers in Europe were managed by Jews, and that anti-Semitism was used as a tool to advance the Jewish agenda. That's what Jensen in the book Hitler's Policy is a Jewish Policy was saying, and Trebek Lincoln says that. Now, Israel Shahak says the same thing in his book Jewish History, Jewish Religion. Now, modern day example, does anybody remember about 30 years ago, I think it was the 70s, there was a march by the Nazis through Skokie, Illinois. That made national news. Almost everybody my age remembers it. Suddenly there was Nazis marching in Skokie, Illinois, national headlines, and oh my gosh, anti-Semitism is back. What came out a little while later, that the guy who led the Nazi party in that march and in the Skokie, Illinois Nazi Fuhrer was a guy named Collins, who himself was Jewish. In other words, the head of the whole Nazi march through Skokie, Illinois was Jewish. He was later convicted of a child molesting. I don't know whether that was a setup to make the Nazis look, Nazis look bad as they should look bad. But my point is what I thought when I saw that, I thought, what is going on here? Well, as Ratisbonne says, we thought that all socialism was of Jewish origin except Nazism, National Socialists. And by the time you get done looking at all this research, I think we can conclude that all socialism was of a Jewish source in the 20th century. Now, in a minute, we're going to finish this section off by reading from The Jewish Connection, a book put out in the last few decades, probably about 1970s, by M. Hirsch Goldberg, which is just a lot of fun facts about the Jewish connection to things and the Jewish connection to Hitler in this book. But before that, I have got to go back to read, as we're going through here, it occurred to me I forgot to read two important things. The first thing is remember the Bridget Heyman book, Hitler's Vienna, came out in 1999. Listen to this. Hitler had this straight... What do we make of this? If the man's not trying to hide something, what do we make of this? I mean, Hitler's an intelligent guy, detail-oriented, and all that kind of stuff. She quotes on page 48, Hitler did not want to hear anything about relatives. I've got no idea about family history. She's quoting him here, according to one source at the William Patrick interview when Hitler and William Patrick, the nephew from Ireland, met. In that area, I'm an absolute dunce. Even when I was younger, I didn't know I had relatives. I've only learned that since I became Rights Chancellor. This reminds me of Madeleine Albright saying she just found out she was Jewish when she became Secretary of State. Can you imagine that? A family with survivors, Holocaust survivors, not mentioning it to her till she's Secretary of State. But he says, again to repeat, I've only learned that I have relatives since I became Rights Chancellor. I am an entirely non-familial being, a non-clanning being by nature. That's not my cup of tea. I only belong to my folkish community. And then on page 51, she quotes, going to this, again to this interview with where he invited William Patrick Hitler to come see him when he was threatening to blackmail him. When Hitler became famous, his poor Irish relatives, whom he did not know, saw their chance to make money and gave interviews to newspapers in England as Hitler's relatives. Subsequently, in 1930, now this is before he came to power, Hitler had 19-year-old Patrick, whom he had never met before, visit him in Munich, where he told him and his half-brother Aloy that he forbade them to do things like that, give interviews about the family. He is supposed to have said that the family should not believe they could become famous at his expense. They're quoting him here from a report of the meeting, I guess from William Patrick Hitler. Quote, although she makes it clear in here, she gives a source if you read it, if you go to the book and so forth. It's footnote 215, but she says, quote, "You're going to do me in," Hitler is talking to William Patrick Hitler. Now again, what do we make of this from a grown man when I'm about to read? "You're going to do me in. How carefully I have always kept my private life and my personal affairs from the press. People must not know who I am. They must not know where I'm from and who my family is. Not even in my book did I allow one word to come out about these things. Not one word," Mein Kampf in other words, not one word about his family. "And then all of a sudden there's a nephew. They will start investigating. They will stick snoopers on the tracks of our past," unquote. In a newspaper interview in 1939, Patrick Hitler even said that his uncle had started sobbing and in his anger shed tears. Again, the great theatricist. What do we make of such talk? I'm asking you, the person watching this tape. So that's from Hitler's Vienna. Then we have, again, something from the Franz Jetzinger book that was written in the 30s. Again, going back to the Hans Frank interview, the book, the pamphlet "In the Face of the Gallows," Hitler's half-Jewish lawyer who was killed at Nuremberg. And this paragraph appears on page 24 of that book. Finally, there is a curious fact which may be interpreted as bearing out Frank's story, Hans Frank's story. Not 2 months after Hitler invaded Austria in May 1938, an order was issued to the land registries concerned to carry out a survey of Dollersheim, Alois Hitler's birthplace, a neighborhood with a view to their suitability as a battle training area for the Wehrmacht. In the following year, the inhabitants of Dollersheim were forcibly evacuated, and the village, together with the surrounding countryside, was blasted and withered by German artillery and infantry weapons. The birthplace of Hitler's father and the site of his grandmother's grave were alike rendered unrecognizable. And today, this whole tract of what was once fertile and flourishing country is an arid desert sown with unexploded shells. But an area so closely associated with Hitler's family could not have been used for battle training without his knowledge and permission. Then why did he give it? Or did Hitler himself initiate the order for the destruction of Dollersheim out of insane hatred of his father and the desire to erase the shame, quote-unquote, of his Jewish blood? Or just the fact, if just the whole area discredits him as the head anti-Semite in the world. So the reason I went back to read that is that it demonstrates, I want to demonstrate that there's a lot of flesh on these points I'm bringing you, and I don't have time to read it all. Now we go back to this book, The Jewish Connection of Hitler, which is just kind of a book of fun facts, but he gets into the Hitler thing, and I think it's quite astounding, some of the stuff he says. He goes into the shop-worn story that the Jewish art dealers spurned Hitler's paintings when he was young, when he was a poor, struggling artist, as well as just a poor artist, is not true, according to an afterword by Robert G.L. Waite, W-A-I-T-E, and a wartime psychological report on Hitler written for the U.S. Office of Strategic Services by Walter C. Langer, and later published as, quote, The Mind of Hitler, of Adolf Hitler. Waite states that Gestapo files clearly show Jewish art dealers befriended the youthful Hitler in Vienna when he was destitute and, quote, paid generously for his mediocre watercolors, unquote. Indeed, most of the paintings Hitler did sell were bought by Jewish dealers. During this period in his life, Hitler was also shown compassion by his landlady, a Jewish woman, who charged him only a small rent because of his situation. Once, to provide more space for Hitler, and a friend. She even moved out of her own apartment. Another Jew who befriended Hitler at the time was a Hungarian old clothes dealer who gave him a long black overcoat. In The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, William Scherer relates that Hitler wore it, quote, so much that the shabby black coat hanging down to his ankles was still remembered by those who knew him then. Interestingly, Shire says, the coat, quote, resembled a kaftan, C-A-F-T-A-N, which I think is a Jewish thing, which, together with its dark color, must have made Hitler look like a Hasidic Jew of that era. A friend of Hitler's in those bleak days, Reinhold Hanisch, H-A-N-I-S-C-H, wrote that, quote, Hitler at that time looked very Jewish, unquote. Now, incidentally, I didn't mean to imply there that Jewish people befriending Hitler would prove anything about him, because that could have, Jewish people befriend many, many people that are close to them, as anyone who's known any Jews know, and are very warm in person most of the time. The point is that Hitler at that time looked very Jewish. As Führer, Hitler hired a Jew to cook for him. What? This is the guy that's supposed to be wiping out every Jew in the world? He is a half-Jewish lawyer. Now we find as Führer, Hitler hired a Jew to cook for him. One Fraulein Condit, who was K-U-N-D-E, who was sent to Hitler by the head of Romania, who, like Hitler, had stomach problems. And when Himmler questioned the suitability of Der Führer's having a Jewish cook and suggested that she be removed, Hitler became furious. A Jew even figured in Hitler's rise to power as a lance corporal during World War I. Hitler was awarded the Iron Cross first and second class. Now, Ratisbonne is big on this fact that Hitler's war decorations were not legitimate. This was an important military honor, and Hitler wielded it as a vital political tool. He wore the medal wherever he went to buttress his claim of being a hero in the World War I fight for Germany's honor. But as Langer points out, Hitler would not have been awarded such an honor, quote, without the persistent efforts of the regimental adjutant Hugo Gutmann, G-U-T-M-A-N-N, a Jew, unquote. I don't have time to go into it here, but if we ever get the longer information together, Ratisbonne has done research into his other war medal, which he believes was also contrived. He believes both of them were contrived. The Hitler family, too, showed friendliness toward Jews. Now here's one of those facts that just isn't erased from history. See what you think of it. Hitler's older half-sister Angela, following World War I, managed the Mensa Academica Judica in Vienna. Let me repeat that. Hitler's older half-sister, Angela, following World War I, managed the Mensa Academica Judaica in Vienna. That's like the Jewish Mensa Society. What do you think of that? What do we make of that this German, Austrian person, I should say, the sister, is leading the Jewish Mensa Society? It's one of those facts of history that I think you can't get them all. And when non-Jewish students rioted in the city, she protected the Jewish students, even wielding a club against the rioters. Of course, that wouldn't prove she was Jewish. I'm just making a point. You put the two together, and it tends to lead that direction. This is page 28 of this book, The Jewish Connection. Yet Angela was the only member of his family that he kept in touch with. Perhaps most fascinating of all is Hitler's relationship with the Jewish physician, Dr. Edward Bloch, B-L-O-C-H. Lucy Davidovich, this is a footnote now, Lucy Davidovich in the War Against the Jews makes note of Hitler's being awarded the Iron Cross first class, but obviously, I'm sorry about that, that's the other footnote. Dr. Bloch's remarkable relationship with Adolf Hitler is spelled out in two articles Bloch wrote for Collier's magazine on March 15th and March 22nd, 1941. The title, My Patient Hitler. Dr. Bloch was the Hitler family doctor for a number of years when Adolf Hitler was young. It was Dr. Bloch who treated Hitler's mother when she was dying of cancer, and after the funeral, Hitler accompanied his sister to thank him. According to Bloch's remembrance of the occasion, Hitler told him, "I shall be grateful to you forever." Of course, that doesn't prove anything. Hitler felt so warmly towards the doctor, and it goes on that the rest of it is not that significant. So here, even through much of the Third Reich, Hitler has a half-Jewish lawyer, a Jewish cook, and a Jewish doctor. Again, this is the man who, and he's got all these Jewish soldiers and officers in general, half-Jewish general. This is the man who was trying to wipe out every Jew in the world. Hitler named his, this is from page 249 of the same book, Hitler named his command headquarters for much of the war the Wolf's Lair, quote unquote, after the animal so you often used to symbolize evil. Hitler also had the nickname, when in his youth, of Wolf, which was often a Jewish nickname, just for the record. Okay. Now, let's see. We want to move now on to two other things. One other thing here, and that is that Hitler, in David Irving's book Hitler, Hitler's War, he says that Hitler never let anyone see him naked, not even medical people. Well, there's been a lot of different explanations of this, but I would say this as a possibility. A circumcised man in pre-World War II Germany would have been recognized as a Jew. So that might have been the motive, that Hitler wouldn't let anyone see him naked. Okay, now, let us move on to the Rakovsky interrogation. Here is a title that a cover that we made for a book that we are working on, although who knows if and when that'll ever be out, where we can find the time. The Rakovsky interrogation in the 21st century, an X-ray on the real history of the 20th century, and there's Hitler, Stalin, and a cartoon drawn, artist rendering of Dr. J. Landowski examining Rakovsky for his health before he went into this interrogation by Stalin. Okay, so now we're back to the Rakovsky we had November 1999 issue of our newspaper, All These Things. Again, we had the Rakovsky interview in the beginning of World War II. This is where we're going to kind of pull it all together regarding what Hitler was about in the next section, but it would have been better to call this the Rakovsky interrogation, because he was in the midst of an interrogation for his life. And we got the 4-page article on all these things. You can also hear me at Fatima.org, which is Father Nicholas Gruner's website. If you find the 2000 Fatima Conference, you can hear me give a 45-minute talk on the Rakovsky interrogation and the article that we wrote and what's around behind it and so forth. Now, here's the book that brought the Rakovsky interview to light. It is called Red Symphony, and a Spanish fellow, we go into it in the article in here, Landowski got out of his imprisonment by Stalin and brought a carbon copy of the interview he was asked to type, and eventually it made its way to Spain, where it was published, and eventually in 1967, 20 years later, 25 years later from when it was found, it made its way into the English language. Here's another book that the Rakovsky interrogation appeared in, which was Towards World Government, The New Order, and Deirdre Manifold, an Irish author who's now in her 80s, published a lot of the Rakovsky interrogation in here. One of the things that occurred to me when I first heard of this was, gee, is this a real book? I mean, is it a real man? And so we finally found in the book Hitler and Stalin, which I'm struggling for right now. Oh, here it is. We finally found in this book, Hitler and Stalin, a picture of Rakovsky carrying a funeral situation. It was a funeral. He was carrying a casket with Stalin. And also you will find, I'm going to look for that picture for a second. Also you will find in the book of Trotsky's book, which is called, I can't remember what Trotsky's book was called. I think it was called My Life or My Biography. Trotsky writes about how important Christian Rakovsky was to the revolution. Trotsky was the communist, one of the founders of communism. Here, I don't know. Here is the funeral, the picture in the book Hitler and Stalin by Alan Bullock. Here's the picture, and there is the casket. They're all carrying the casket. There's Joseph Stalin, and right behind him there, you can only see part of his face, is Christian Rakovsky, who was a top-level Mason, top-level Jewish operative, and really a gentleman conspirator, if you will, or a gentleman banker type of a thing. Now, let's get to the... I'm going to quit looking at notes so much here and give you Ratisbone's summary of what happened here. When communism was founded in 1922, then... Excuse me, in 1917, when the communists finally took over from Stalin, when the communists finally took over from the Tsar of Russia, the Tsar was overthrown. Stalin and people like him were in the Tsar's secret police, though, and that's another story in itself. But when the Tsar was overthrown, Lenin was the head of communism, we know. Now, Lenin, it's been revealed in Jewish papers since that time, was himself at least one-fourth Jewish. Communism, like Zionism, is basically a Jewish phenomenon. We could get this is probably a subject for another tape, and there's distinctions to be made and all that. I can't make every distinction in this tape, so forgive me for that. I'm sure people could argue with various things. We're not trying to oversimplify. We're just trying to get through a basic story here. It's kind of like a high school history book, but it's one that's a lot more accurate. When the communists took over Russia. Incidentally, to show you how bad it was, in the book The Rulers of Russia by Father Dennis Fahey, which we have right here, he goes in from many sources of how heavily Jewish, like 80-90%, the leaders of communism were. And he quotes a Douglas Reed, who was the author of Far and Wide, in a book we're going to look at in a minute, a very famous historian who once worked for the London Times. He quotes in there that at the time of the Russian Revolution, many of the Jews were flown in from New York City and couldn't even speak Russian. So that's what happened when the Russia was taken over by the Communist Revolution. Anyway, at the time, this is history. I went through Catholic high school, Catholic grade school, Catholic college. Never heard this story, but at the time, at the end of World War I, after Russia had been taken over, the leaders of the World Revolution, the Rothschilds, the Schiffs, the bankers who fund communism, Jacob Schiff and so forth, they thought, hey, Europe is in ruins, everybody's exhausted, let's just take the peasants of Russia and march over and take over all of Europe right now in 1917. Let's just get the job done with. So they started with the NKVD, or what would come to be called the KGB and the secret police, with machine guns at the back, as often was done to keep the peasants moving forward in every army. They started to march them west to take over Russia, to take over from Russia to take over Europe. Now, in anticipation of this, many of you have probably heard of this, but I never knew what to make of it or why it happened. Bela Kun and the communists took over Budapest, Hungary. Communists took over Munich, Germany, and this is going to relate back to Hitler in a few minutes. And they took over several other places in Europe. Why did they do that? They did that because they were anticipating that the communist armies would come across and be there in a few months. So they took it over, and they were waiting for the communist armies to come. Now, the Poles, who were very poorly, had almost nothing but forks and knives to fight with, put up a tremendous fight against the communist forces along the Vistula River in the area of 1919 to 1922. Again, I'm going to refer to the Encyclopedia Britannica for exactly the dates. But they put up such an unexpected, tremendous fight that enough confusion was thrown into the communist armies that the peasants were able to throw off the secret police behind them with machine guns and kill them. And so the Russian peasants, who couldn't have cared less about getting killed marching to take over Europe, stopped and marched back to Russia. And the Poles had a tremendous victory. The Poles had all kinds of prayers going, rosary processions. Cardinal Ratti, I think at that time he might have been a bishop, who was eventually to become Pope Pius XI. Here's a picture of Pope Pius XI as a younger man. He was in Poland at the time, and the Vatican told him to come home, and he said no. He was Pope from 1922 to 1939, so he would have been he would have been in, this is a picture of him as a younger man, but he was in Poland right before he became Pope. They said, come home. He said, no, I can't. The thing's so desperate here, I got to stay here and try to rally the troops and so forth. Give morale to the people by showing them that I'm not fleeing. Well, anyway, they stopped the communists. I found this story when Ratisbonne told me about it so unbelievable that I had to go check it out. How could I never have heard of this great victory of Catholic Poland against the communists? Well, I went to the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is kind of an establishment source, certainly not a Catholic source, and they've said in there, it's under Poland in like the 1989 edition, and I can imagine you could find it elsewhere. They've said that basically that defeat on the Vistula River at the hands of the Poles under General Pilsudski ended the hopes of the communists to take over Europe in that generation. Words to that effect. Ended the hopes of Europe to take over the communists. Ended the hopes of the communists to take over Europe in that generation. Wow. So here's what was going on there. I might fast forward. Many of you have heard of the Katyn Forest Massacre, where 15,000 Polish soldiers were marched out and shot in the back of the head by the communists. That was payback for what their fathers did a generation earlier, stopping this communist advance. This was a tremendous defeat for what the communists and the Rothschilds wanted when they lost that battle. And of course, at that time, Bela Kun and the communists in Munich were overthrown, and we're going to get back to Hitler in that regard in a minute. Now, the Rothschilds and the gentlemen Jewish bankers like Rakovsky, Christian Rakovsky, who, again, top-level Jewish Freemason, wanted someone to take over for Lenin. Lenin started to get sick about that time, and they wanted Trotsky to take over, and they wanted someone who would go for world communism right now. Well, what happened is several things happened, and this might have been due to the prayers of the people in the Western world and the free world. Trotsky, at the moment that Lenin was going downhill, got sick, terribly sick in the Crimea, and he was out of commission. He just was sick, and he had intermarried with the Rothschild, Schiff, all the top bankers. He married one of the daughters of the top bankers. He was their man. He was sick. Stalin took Lenin prisoner, basically pretending he was helping him, and poisoned him to death. There's an HBO movie I think it's called Lenin and Stalin, but there's an HBO movie out. It might just be called Stalin, can't remember. And it deals with this in a very historical type of a way. I don't know, it appeared on normal television, it was made by HBO. That's where I saw part of it. You can get it on video, though. I looked it up. I haven't got it, though, but it might be of interest for some people. Okay, now, he's poisoned Lenin to death, and Stalin took over. Now, at that time, the Rothschilds were so upset of this because Stalin was determined to concentrate on Russia. He just wanted to consolidate communism in Russia. And I might add, what communism meant was that people no longer would own their own things. They would no longer own their own tools. They would no longer own their own factories. They would be part of the commune. But all these peasants, and in Hitler and Stalin, Ratisbonne pointed out to me where it said that the communist Jews, greatly feared the simple peasants, most of whom couldn't read, had a simple Christian faith. They feared them, and they needed to take their tools away from them and communize them, make them part of the commune. That's where the word comes from. Well, Stalin was the guy, when he took over, that starved out the Ukrainians, and he went ahead and did this. He did what they thought was almost unthinkable by using brutal tactics. He turned all these proud Ukrainian and Russian farmers into part of the big commune run by this was to be the new paradise that didn't go so well. Now, the Rothschilds and the gentlemen bankers, if you will, the gentlemen conspirators, did not like what Stalin was doing. They wanted an international revolution in the sense of go after everything again, go after Europe right now, and Trotsky was their man. So what they did is they had about 22 of their men, including Christian Rakovsky, stay around Stalin. And it was in 1938 that Stalin found out that these people were around him only to overthrow him. He arrested them all, and that became the show trials of 1938. And that's where this thing happens now, where they're going to put on show trial and kill all of these 26 or so people that stayed around Stalin, Christian Rakovsky being one of them. And this is where they hear, well, the Jews lost control of Russia. Well, not exactly, but part of the Jews who were working for the Rothschilds did get arrested by Stalin. Ratisbonne says, think of World War II this way. We had the gentleman Jewish super criminals funding communism through Jacob Schiff. Remember Lenin being funded in the sealed train with $10 million going across Germany into Russia. Trotsky was arrested in Canada right before the Russian Revolution. President Wilson was told to call and get him free, to which President Wilson did at the direction of Bernard Baruch. And as we'll see, the Rothschilds through Warburg also fund Hitler up the line, and Rakovsky explains why this happened, how disillusioned they were with Stalin. So we got the gentleman Jewish conspirators up there, the ones who don't get their hands dirty, of which if you look at Rakovsky and hear him talk, he was clearly one. And then you got the half-Jewish gangsters like Stalin in Russia, in Moscow, who took over communism there, and later you have the mostly half-Jewish or part-Jewish Nazis in Berlin who took over there, both funded up by the Rothschilds. Now, what the point is that Rakovsky basically has an inside track, and he says to Stalin's men, in effect, interview me tonight and you will not kill me in the morning. In fact, he was to be killed a few weeks later, but in effect he said, interview me now, interview me tonight, and you will not kill me in the morning. And so Stalin's curious, and he arranges for a midnight interrogation that lasts for 6 hours, from midnight to 6 a.m., of his man Kusmin, Kusmin, interviews Rakovsky, and Stalin demands that this Christian Pole, Dr. J. Landowski, who was brilliant in translation, be present. Also, it was not a torture or anything, although Landowski tells he often had to witness tortures. But they're there in a fireplace with soft chairs, drinking wine. One of Landowski's jobs was to put something in Rakovsky's drink, kind of like the effect of truth serum, to try to get him to loosen up a little bit. And the first thing that Kusmin says in this interview that Stalin's man says to Rakovsky is, tell me the real truth, Rakovsky, not the truth meant for the public. In other words, if you're your life's on the line. Don't forget that your life is on the line if you don't tell us what we need to. So Rakovsky says, look, we became more Stalinist than Stalin to stay around him because we are, them, he calls the bankers them or they are very displeased with Stalin. They look at Stalin as a Bonapartist. And so Ratisbonne says, well, what is a Bonapartist? He's looking, and he finally explained to me, he finally figured out what is a Bonapartist. Napoleon was helped up the line by the Jews to break up certain things in Europe then and try to break up the Christian order then. But Napoleon eventually turned on the Jews, and then they turned on him, and he ended up dying on the little island of, I think it was Elbe, off of France. And Napoleon was someone who started out as helped and funded by the Jewish establishment, and he turned on him. And that's why they call Stalin a Bonapartist. He took the help up the line, and then he went on his own program. And they were furious with him. And from 1922 to 1938, they were trying to figure out how to get rid of him and replace him with Trotsky. Now, here comes Stalin, and he's not going for he's not going for it. And incidentally, notice that 2 years after this interview, where Rakovsky spills all these beans, that they were staying around Stalin just to get rid of him and to put Trotsky in, that Stalin then sends somebody out after Trotsky. They find him in Mexico City and kill him at the age of 61 with an ice pick in 1940. That gets all over Life magazine. So that puts the end. Stalin again triumphs over the Rothschilds here. But so Christian Rakovsky is telling them that, look, Stalin was a Bonapartist, so we felt the only people that could create enough confusion and perhaps start a war and overthrow Stalin were the Germans. So then they begin looking around and they find this tremendously gifted orator, Hitler, who they then get behind. Okay, now, and he explains that was the main, and Rakovsky even says in this interview, which is very hard to understand at parts unless you've got somebody who can really be a guide, he says, things went from bad to worse for us from 1922 to 1938. They went from bad to worse. Well, that wasn't how the free world was looking at it. The free world was looking at it like, gee, communism is making such gains. They may take over the whole world soon. So it's interesting to see it from that they weren't making the progress they wanted. Now, at this point, we have to introduce another character in an important book by Douglas Reed called The Prisoner of Ottawa, written by Douglas Reed, the famous historian who wrote The Controversy of Zion, who wrote Far and Wide, who was the London Times correspondent in Moscow during the Russian takeover, and he was also there for many other parts of key history in that time. And he wrote a book about one of Hitler's main rivals, Otto Strasser. He was a rival in the Nazi Party. He was not someone who wanted to put the emphasis on race. He was against cruelty. And Strasser ended up being chased out of Germany by Hitler. But Douglas Reed visits him in Ottawa after World War II and writes 3 books with him, one of which is called The Prisoner of Ottawa. We have to introduce him because Strasser says what I recognize, and many of you would recognize who have tried to fight the political establishment. He says, one day in 1929, we were overwhelmed by Hitler because he had unlimited finances. We were overwhelmed by Hitler because he has unlimited finances. Well, go back to Rokofsky interview. He says that in 1929, Warburg was sent from the U.S. to give Hitler $10 million, which today might be the equivalent of $100 million. And interestingly enough, in the book Who Financed Hitler by James Poole, which we'll get to later. I don't know if, let me see if I can grab it here. There we go. Who Financed Hitler, James Poole says that in 1933 campaign, the Nazis had unlimited money. He says how everything was taken care of. They had campaigns all over Germany, and they just had unlimited money. So this fits in. I mean, yes, you could collect some from German businessmen, maybe quite a bit, but when you're talking about unlimited money, like, for instance, Clinton had in 96 or Bush had in 2000, there's something more going on here than just $10 and $20 donations from businessmen. So that book was written in the late 60s, early 70s by 2 people from Cincinnati, Ohio, James and Suzanne Poole. So anyway, to make the Rokofsky says, look, he's telling in this interview. One other thing I wanted to mention, let me just stop here for a second, about Douglas Reed, who wrote this book, The Prisoner of Ottawa. In one of his books, I think it's Far and Wide, it might be the Zionist Connection, he talks about how, this is one of those facts I had in my mind for a decade or didn't know what to make of it. He was in Poland the day that Hitler invaded and took over. And he says, a Jewish guy he'd known for years walks in, looked at him, kind of blushed and turned red, and said, "Hi, Doug," and walked up to the front of the room. He was Hitler's man in Poland, explaining about how the Nazis took over Poland. And I thought, well, how could this Jewish guy be Hitler's spokesman? When you realize that Nazism was a bunch of half-Jews and cooperating with Zionism, now it doesn't become so strange. So anyway, Rokofsky basically says in this thing that, you know, we were here to overthrow Stalin, but to get himself out of being killed, he tells Koosman, he says, look, here's a plan for Stalin to get all the help he needs, because Stalin wasn't getting cooperation from the United States and other places like he wanted to from that, he'd got some, but he did not. It wasn't like he needed for how poor Russia was and so forth. He says, here's what you need to do. You get Hitler into a pact. In other words, this was the plan that began World War II. You get Hitler into a pact to invade Poland. Stalin invades the eastern part of Poland. Hitler invades the western part of Poland. And Koosman says, well, how is that going to help us? That's going to make both of us odious in the eyes of the West. He says, no, if you do that, the Western papers will all attack Hitler, but they will not attack Stalin. And that will be, then we will make the alliances of, there'll be an alliance of England and France and so forth and Russia, and then we'll attack, and then we'll have Hitler where we want him. And he says, this is how you get the cooperation of the West. So Koosman says, well, this is all talk. You could just be. So he says, well, look, go see the new ambassador in Russia, Roosevelt's new ambassador, Davis, and bounce this off of him. So Koosman goes and finds that Rokofsky's telling him the truth. Rokofsky is transmitting to him what the Rothschilds hope will happen. Stalin needs help. He explains in there that Hitler became, before that, he explains that Hitler has become more of a Bonapartist than Stalin. In other words, as mad as they were at Stalin, they were more mad at Hitler. And I don't mean by this presentation to suggest that Hitler did not was not in large part what he appeared to be. Hitler wanted to be a player. He wanted to be the head of the new order in Europe. He felt, according to Ratisbonne, and I would say that it's plausible that he felt that the half German, half Jewish individual was the natural leader, and the industry of the German people was the natural leadership of the world. And but he did something, and Rokowski explains what Hitler did that was so bad, and that, from the point of view of the Rothschilds. You may remember that he issued his own money, and this is a whole story in itself. He issued his own money, and Rokowski says, we don't know how this elemental man found this out. There is an exact progression of how he found it out, but he says, but he issued his own money, which destroyed our power. In other words, he wasn't taking loans anymore from the Rothschilds. He said, we haven't even called attention to this in our press because we're afraid other nations would notice the formula and develop it themselves, and this would destroy our power. In other words, if they could not issue the money at interest and get the nations in debt, this was destroy their power. And Hitler doing this was far worse than anything Stalin ever did. So they re-teamed up with Stalin, and now Hitler was on the offensive. Now, another thing that needs to be on the defensive once this happened. So Hitler got lured into the pact. He maybe did it partially because he was afraid of communism and wanted to perhaps get in his pact before he attacked Stalin. Whatever the case was, he fell for it. Both Hitler and Stalin invaded Poland, and then the Western press immediately attacked Hitler mercilessly. Now, this is a very critical thing here. As an aside, the Polish American Society, led by Dana Alvey, Papurek, Papurec.org, I believe, on the internet, she says that the Nazis and the Communists both did the same thing when they took over Poland. They both killed all of the intelligentsia. So they both acted like a very hostile force to Christianity when they're invading Catholic Poland. So that's just an aside there. But so Hitler now realizes something has gone wrong, and there's another whole aspect to this thing with the Nazis, and that Hitler had a lot of support in England from the Cliveden group, which was a lot of Jewish rich people who had become lords and had gotten themselves into the English aristocracy. He thought he had an understanding. This explains why he let the English Navy go at Dunkirk, where he had them surrounded, could have easily destroyed them, and he didn't. He did not want a knockdown, drag-out war, but when him and Stalin invaded Poland and the Western press only attacked him, Hitler realized something had gone wrong. This is when Rudolf Hess flew into Europe and flew into England, and the purpose he flew in there in 1942 was to say, what has gone wrong? What went wrong? Is there any way to salvage the deal? And Churchill immediately arrested Hess before he could see anybody. And as you remember, Hess was kept in Spandau prison from 1945 till 1949 for 44 years. And people say, well, why was this done? Well, I'm suggesting we're giving you the reason why this was done. Hess was an example to all the British aristocracy who knew this information. He was an example to anyone in the world who knew this Zionist Nazi connection and all this background information, that if you speak, you're going to end up dead, or you're going to end up like Rudolf Hess in a prison. To make an example of him in Spandau prison, he was there in a prison that held 300 people. He was in a prison that held 300 people, and he was there all alone for 44 years. And every month, 1 week the United States soldiers marched around Spandau prison, 1 week the Russians, 3rd week the French, 4th week the British. This was a real message to anyone in the world that you better not reveal what it really went on with this part of World War II, or you're going to end up like Rudolf Hess. I've never heard any other explanation for why they kept him in that prison for 44 years with 4 nations guarding him, that even remotely made any sense except for this here. So Hitler realized the deal was off, and then World War II went on. I'll just mention in passing that the Rokowski interview took place when a strange unknown light appeared from Moscow to Alaska in the exact 6 hours of that interview, in Catholic sources, many of which, myself included, believe that that was the unknown light of Fatima, predicted by Sister Lucy. She said there would be a strange, Fatima was an apparition in 1917, witnessed by 70,000 people, whether people want to believe in it or not. That 70,000 people testified to it, including the secular paper in Poland and Portugal called O Secula. Sister Lucy said an unknown light will appear in the sky before the next great war. She said that about 1922. There was a strange, unexplained light that did not fit the Aurea Borealis that appeared exactly at the time that Rakovsky was being interviewed on July 25th, 1938. And during those 6 hours is when he gave Stalin the idea that grew into World War II 17 months later. Hitler invaded Austria 3 months later. Incidentally, Rakovsky and one other man's life was spared. The other 24 were killed by Stalin. Now, want to get now back to a strange thing in Hitler's life regarding this whole thing. And Rakovsky there gives a lot of insights that it's hard to understand what was happening in World War II without knowing what he said and why the side shifted and all that type of thing. Getting back to Otto Strasser for a minute, prisoner of Otto, one of the things he says in there, he says to read that 3 things in Hitler's history need to be studied. 1, his murky origins. 2, what he was doing in Munich in 1919 while the communists ruled the city for 6 months. And 3, what happened to him after the war. Because at that time in 1953, everybody, and Reed and Strasser among them, said Hitler was not found in his bunker, that there were no evidence. Now, in 1989, Russia released their archives and said he was found. But at that time, and I remember when I was a kid in the 60s, there was no evidence that Hitler disappeared from his bunker. That's another subject we're not going to get into here, but don't have time. But Strasser said that Hitler was in Munich for the 6 months that the communists ruled Munich. Okay, now, what Strasser said was that in the 20s, when Hitler was rising up through the ranks of the Nazi Party or was becoming very prominent, he said sometimes over a beer after the meeting, some of the old soldiers or the soldiers who had been around for a while and knew about the 1919 campaign, which was only a few years earlier, how the von Epps Corps freed Munich from the communists. They said, what was Adolf doing in Munich during the communist occupation? In other words, Adolf Hitler was in Munich for the communist occupation. He said they would usually shrug their shoulders and move on. Strasser was accusing him of working with the communists. Now, and we now have a confirmation of that in a recent history, which we'll get to in just a second. What happened was the communists ruled that city for 6 months, and then the von Epps Corps, of which Otto Strasser was a part, freed Munich from the communists. They were all awarded the von Epps Cross, I believe it was called, the von Epps Cross, for doing that. Hitler came out and was given some kind of a dispensation, which is covered in some of these books, and he was not looked at as being someone who was prosecuted or anything. But in the recent book by the establishment historian who's appeared on C-SPAN and elsewhere from Great Britain, I think he's from Oxford, it's one of the major universities in England, his name is Ian Kershaw, and he came out with a book called Hitler in 1999. In there he says, and quotes it with sources, that Hitler was the go-between between the communist leadership of Munich and the soldiers in parts of the barracks. In other words, he would get the orders from the communist leaders and go and speak and deliver them to the communist to the soldiers in the barracks. And Ian Kershaw says in this history, of course, Hitler history, of course, he's an establishment historian, that this part of Hitler's past is very difficult to reconcile with everything else. Well, I'm telling you how to reconcile it here. Hitler was part Jewish, according to all these arrows that we've pointed, that point that direction. He was searching as a young man, what is my place? He thought the communists might take over all of Europe if Stalin's forces were right, and he was trying to find his place. He didn't. It didn't work out, and he then got involved in the Nazi Party. and Hitler is one of those individuals, I believe, who could speak with more conviction than those who really believed it. I've met some of these people. If they speak, you feel, gee, this person believes harder than anybody else. You later find out that they really didn't believe that hard. They didn't believe in it at all. And I believe Hitler was one of those people. I'm not saying he didn't believe in what he said at all, but I believe his own desire to be a player in the world leadership was more important than anything that he was saying to the people. Okay, now, so that little punchline is another indication that there's a very strange side of Hitler that nobody knows about. So that nobody has brought together till this point. Let's put it that way. Okay, now we are going to go into the some other facts about the Zionist-Nazi connection, and then we'll be finished here. Okay, now, let me make one general statement here. We're not telling you to disregard all the other histories or all the other things you knew about Hitler and Germany and World War II, but we are saying without this information we're explaining here, that there's whole pieces that just don't make any sense. You just have to put them out of your mind and say, that doesn't fit, I just can't deal with it, forget it. We're now giving you a way to fit all the pieces together, even though we may not be able to get into, for instance, the Holocaust and so forth to a sufficient level in this tape. But all the pieces fit when you have this piece of Hitler's part Jewishness, his cooperation in accepting a deal from the international bankers, and what all happened from there. Now, going here to the House of Nazi, which is a book that we got from Interlibrary Loan that is mentioned by Nor Davis in his Star Wars series in the 80s. Sure enough, here's a book has to do with the House of Nazi, very close incidentally to Nazi, N-A-S-I, of Joseph of Nazi of the 16th century. Believe it or not, one of the things in this book, and this is kind of a book by Jews written for Jews, because it says the publication of this volume by the Jewish Publication Society of America was made possible by the so and so on and so forth. Now, what they say in this book is that in the 1550s, 1560s, Joseph of Nazi, who was like the prince of all world, must have been a very charismatic guy, the prince of worldwide Jewry at that time, was trying the first transfer agreement. He was trying to find a way to get the Jews back to Palestine, where they had been scattered at the time that the Roman Temple was destroyed in 70 A.D. And what he did is, and if my memory serves correct, he made a deal with the ruler of Crete. He made it. He with a lot of intrigue, he and his followers pushed a guy to be head of Crete. The deal was that when this guy became head of Crete, he would persecute the Jews, and Joseph of Nazi would have a way for them to get to Palestine so that they could try to resettle in Palestine. Same thing we're saying happened with Hitler 400 years later. It didn't work that well because there wasn't modern communications. They couldn't move that many people. A lot of things got in the way. Christendom was strong then. One of the things in this book, Catholics talk about the victory of Lepanto. At that time, Nazi and them were working with the Muslims to try to break up Christendom. And a great victory in Catholic history is in 1571 in Lepanto, when the Christian forces won a great naval battle against the Muslims. Well, this was Pope St. Pius V was Pope then. It was a great victory. In this book it says that the leaders of the Jews then, Joseph of Nazi, talk about the unmitigated disaster of Lepanto. So they were hoping that the Muslim forces would break up Christendom to help give the Jews more influence in Europe. Didn't work out that way, but that's some of the stuff in this book. The reason I bring it up, you can get the whole book for anything. I'm giving you these sources so you can check these things for yourselves rather than just believe my quick few sentence synopsis of it. And I'm not saying it's impossible. I have a shading or a emphasis wrong here or there. We're trying to lead people into legitimate research here. The House of Nazi is a book that talks about this first attempt at a transfer agreement and working with a leader who would persecute the everyday Jews to try to scare them out of a place and get them down back to Palestine. Okay, now, let's move from there to the modern transfer agreement. We put this up. This is only, I don't have this book. This book is easily available on Amazon. It's, again, by Edwin Black. This is the modern transfer agreement. We explained it already, where there was a deal between Zionist company in Palestine at that time, Havre, and the Nazis to ship German goods through the Zionists so they could make a profit. They made tens of millions that way towards the preparation of the takeover of Palestine. I contend this had to be the fulfillment of the deal that Hitler took for accepting the funding. Whether Hitler planned to overthrow the Rothschilds and that eventually, maybe he did. We're just saying this explains what happened. So that was a very important transfer agreement. Big book here. It's about 400 pages and very important reading. I think he says that 60,000 Jews were transferred in the 30s from Germany and in Europe to down to Palestine. Okay, another book, Ben Hecht. Ben Hecht was a Hollywood writer. He was the assistant to David O. Selznick on the movie Gone with the Wind. Ben Hecht, if you ever see the movie From Here to Eternity, his name appears on the screen near the beginning of the movie as big as the screen itself as the screenwriter. He's a very brilliant writer. This book is a very intriguing book. I don't agree with his position, but he was a committed Zionist, a Hollywood producer and writer, screenwriter, raising money to help the Irgun, which was like the front force freedom fighters or terrorists, whichever side you're on, of the founding of Israel. And this whole book Ben Hecht has here is a book about a Hungarian Jew who put out a few mimeograph pamphlets about a Jew named Katzner who had cooperated with the Nazis to and betrayed hundreds of thousands of Jews into concentration camps. And Greenwald was so mad about it, he was a man in his 70s or 80s, that he was trying through this little Xerox or mimeograph method in a few cafes and market squares to pass this out in Israel. Well, the Israeli government overreacted and sued him for libel. And it looked like he was going to be railroaded, but he got one of these former Irgun lawyers who had seen Ben-Gurion and seen the leaders of Israel betray the frontline people over and over again. He became his lawyer. Make a long story short, this was big news in Israel in the mid-50s, didn't make it to the rest of the world. The Irgun lawyer traps Katzner on the stand, proves he collaborated with the Nazis, and then Katzner was assassinated by a mugger a few weeks later to get him out of the way. He was the Secretary of State of Israel at that point. To make a long story short, this is a tale. This book explains the top Zionists preventing people from helping the everyday Jews in these countries. After the war, of course, when people were in all these concentration camps or post-concentration camps, the Zionists were all there trying to get them down to Israel. But there was deals made, and the Nazis and the Zionists were working together. That's what this book shows. Ben Hecht says in here, he says, look, I thought when we had our own country, we would be much better than all the other countries. He says, in effect, Ben-Gurion and our leaders have been worse than the leaders of the other countries. And his book was written in 1961, and it went out of print for a while, but it's back in print now. I'm sure they ran it out of print as fast as they could before the modern era of late 1990s and the internet and on-demand printing, where you can, and it's just hard to keep, and Xeroxing, where you can hardly keep anything from being printed, and nobody can keep anything from being printed. But Ben Hecht, in effect, at the end of this book, just basically says, what is going on? And I'm telling you, what was going on is Nazism and Zionism were two sides of the same coin, one run by committed Jews, the other run by half-Jews. Now, there's an interesting, let's move on from that, because that's basically what you need to know about perfidy for right now. Next thing we're going to talk about is Lenny Brenner's book. This man is still alive. He's in New York City. The name of his book is Zionism in the Age of the Dictators. And boy, I don't have the right, I have this in better form than this, but there you go. Zionism in the Age of the Dictators. This is on the internet at Kodoh, CODOH.com. The whole book's on the internet, or you can now get a copy again. And Brenner's written a few books. We're going to mention one other before we quit here. Zionism, revisionism and Nazism is chapter 11. And here's an interesting thing. He gets into why some of the Jews, the Zionists at that time, the top Zionists, we're always talking about the top leaders here, supported Hitler and started the fascist movements in Italy and supported Hitler. And he says what happened was, and many of you watching will know about the Balfour Agreement at the end of World War I, where when England was going to lose to Germany and was looking like we were definitely going to lose, the top Zionists came to the English and said, look, we will bring America into the war on your side in 1917, but you got to promise to help us get Palestine after the war, because we want to resettle Jews in Palestine, have a state there. And Lord Balfour said, yeah, we'll do that, and issued the Balfour Declaration. Well, by the 30s, in the late 20s, a lot of these Jewish leaders like Menachem Begin, who became later Prime Minister of Israel, said, hey, we don't believe the English are ever going to give us Palestine. We got to do something to break up their empire, break up their power. These individuals, the Zionist revisionist, then helped Mussolini found his fascism, were supporting Hitler and working with Adolf Eichmann and so on and so forth. And he goes into this at great length. And a lot of this book, he again is from like a socialist Jewish background, or at least his parents were. And he's like so many of the authors that have written about this, they're just furious the way that their parents and so forth were treated by the Nazis who were fighting the communists. And so it was like I say it was an internecine feud, but that book is very important on many fronts. Now, Brenner, let's see. I want to mention something else about Brenner there. Lenny Brenner talked also. Let's see. I lost my train of thought here. Okay, well, let's move on to. Hopefully, I'll come back to that. The Secret World Government is another book written in the 1920s by Major General Count Shirop Spiratovich. He was a Russian who came to the United States after the communists took over. He in there talks about the continuity of taking the government further away from the people from Bismarck to Hitler. And one of the things that was happening, there were several things happening after World War I that had the top Jews very worried. One was Henry Ford's book, The International Jew, which I have in the other room but didn't bring in here. You can find that, I'm sure, in many places now. The International Jew by Henry Ford was being translated into many languages and spread across Europe and the world and America because the Jewish hand in the Communist Revolution was so noticeable. Also, there was a movement between Alsace-Lorraine, France, and Bavaria of Germany to unite and have kind of a Catholic power in Central Europe. Hitler was arrested for one time, a man that was advocating this unity of the Catholic states. He went up and punched the guy in the face and spent some time in prison because Hitler was in this movement of primarily Jewish-backed movement, as Spiratovich had said. All the Jews that were around Bismarck, and others have said this too. That was in one of the other books we referred to earlier, and the other leaders, Wilhelm, all the Jewish advisors, all the German constitutions, trying to get this centralized government of all the Germanic people. Hitler realized that Catholic Renaissance around the Habsburg dynasty would have derailed this. So in 1920 or so, or 23, he ran up and hit somebody in the face during a big hall meeting who was advocating this, and that's some of that is recounted. That type of history is recounted in this book, The Hidden Hand by Count Shirop Spiratovich. We already mentioned as far as Hitler's funding. Let me again remind you. Who Financed Hitler has a lot of I can put it here, Who Financed Hitler, and then another book by another great researcher, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler by Anthony Sutton. Anthony Sutton also passed away recently, but here you'll find a lot of the American firms and the companies that were helping the Nazis do their job, and this is very solid documentation. This book is actually it's condensed from much longer research that Sutton did. Okay, we're going to mention just a few more books, and then we're going to sum up here. Where in the world did that? Let's see. I need to find one other thing here. Okay, The War Against the Jews by Lucy Davidovich. In here, she and she documents that many of the Jewish leaders in America were wanting to establish the Palestinian state so badly, the Jewish state in Palestine, that they did not intervene. They claimed the Vatican didn't intervene. They didn't intervene at all they didn't intervene at all to help a lot of the Jews who were being rounded up by the Nazis, which again I say is two sides of the same coin, because they wanted the persecution so they could prove that they needed the Jewish state. They wanted to prove persecution. She documents that Wise and Rabbi Wise and a lot of other prominent Jews in Congress and elsewhere did not help. Another book is the here's a very important pamphlet about how the Jews were backing fascism and Nazism. This is called The Jews of Italy, and it's put out by the B'nai B'rith, and it's put out in 1938. And I'm trying to find that here. Well, it says 1937 there, but the notes here, if we find the right place in the book, it's 1938. It's put out by the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, Jews of Italy, 1938. And what it says in here is how the Zionist had to explain to Mussolini what his job was to be. And Mussolini and Adolf Eichmann, listen to this now, Mussolini and Adolf Eichmann set up training camps for the Irgun in Italy and in many of Hitler's occupied territories. Adolf Eichmann spoke Yiddish. Cardell accuses him states in Adolf Hitler, founder of Israel, which book we referred to earlier, that Eichmann was hiding that he was a full-blooded Jew, that he spoke Yiddish, that he went down to Palestine many times. He set up training camps for the Irgun, and this was all done under Hitler's regime, surely with Hitler's knowledge. How do we explain, if Hitler was what we're told he was, that he's setting up training camps to help the Irgun train so that they can eventually take over Palestine? So this is a very hard-to-find, little-known pamphlet. Here's another book. Can't get away without mentioning this one. You can find it on Amazon. Special Treatment, The Untold Story of Hitler's Third Race. Special Treatment, The Untold Story of Hitler's Third Race. This is a review of it by the Institute for Historical Review. It was written by a fellow named, I have to look at it here, written by a fellow named Alan Abrams, and this is about all of the half-Jews that Hitler classified as Germans, Hitler and the Nazis classified as Germans. Either in the review or in the book, somebody says, I think it was in the book, the guy in confusion says, gee, if Hitler hadn't protected all these half-Jews, all the Jews might have been wiped out, something to that effect. The guy obviously not understanding what was going on. Hitler, I'm asserting here, felt that the half-Jews and half-Germans were the natural leaders of mankind, and the industry of the German people filled out the leadership of mankind, and he would be the leader of it all. So, very important book there. Probably most people have not heard of that. Criminal Politics did 3 articles. That's a magazine put out by L.T. Patterson. He had 3 issues. This one from March 1998, Zionist-Nazi Collaboration by Eustace Mullins. All of those are very Zionist-Nazi collaboration from February 1998. And he had another magazine, all very interesting information in there. Take too long to go into here. For this whole period and the struggle for world power, we might want to use the term globalist Zionist, which was just given to me, to explain these people who were collaborating with the top Nazis. A book to get, I don't know if I can put my hands on it here, but it's called The Controversy of Zion. Do I have it? I don't know, but you can remember the title, hopefully. Let's see if it's down here. Yeah. Okay, The Controversy of Zion. It's here, but I can't find it. It's written by Douglas Reed, and that gives you a lot of the history. That gives you a lot of history of that period. The Abandonment of the Jews. Can I find that? By David Wyman. Another book, The Abandonment of the Jews, another book that brings out the incredible way that the powerful Jews in America wanted a Palestinian state so bad that they allowed the Nazi roundup of the Jews to occur in many countries and the persecution. That made the reason why we have to have a Jewish state. And they point out how they could have intervened at many points and they didn't. This is where the revisionists, some of which who want to say that almost no Jews were killed by Hitler or were not rounded up or persecuted, is just not correct. It's just not correct. It goes too far, although the Jews in Hollywood and Steven Spielberg, in their depiction of what happened in the Holocaust, also goes far, and maybe I'll have a little chance to address that near the end of this, which will be very soon. Dr. John Coleman, you can buy it from him, The Life and Death of Rudolf Hess. That's something else that I'll refer to, and that gets to all these connections Hitler had with England. Remember we talked about how the top Jews were backing Bismarck to Hitler, centralize the government of Germany, get rid of the religious unification, just make it a Germanic unification. There's several books, one by Nesta Webster, that in effect talk about the German Bolshevik conspiracy. Nesta Webster might have written. Is this what she wrote? I don't even know if this is hers or not. But there's a number of books about how there was a lot of kibitzing, if you will, between German leaders and Jewish leaders leading up to the time of Hitler. Okay, that's another piece of documentation that we do not want to miss here. And Jim Marrs. This is on the site www.thebirdman.com. Selected quotes from Jim Marrs' book Rule by Secrecy. So you get to get his book Rule by Secrecy. He brings in out there a Russian Jew, Alfred Rosenberg, you may have heard of, and the important part he played in forming Hitler's thinking regarding how to handle how to rise to power and so on and so forth. New book out, and gee, if I have it, I know I have a page on it here, but I don't know if I can find it. There's a new book quickly now, but there's a new book out called 51 Documents, Zionist Collaboration with the Nazis. That's by Lenny Brenner. 51 Documents, Zionist Collaboration with the Nazis. So I don't think I have it here, but it's on Amazon. I'll just repeat the title again. 51 Documents, Zionist Collaboration with the Nazis. Okay, so I did just find what I told you I couldn't find. There it is, 51 Documents, Zionist Collaboration with the Nazis by Lenny Brenner. And here's what the book description is. I'm going to read it because it's a good beginning of an ending here. The Nazi era is the most discussed period in history, yet most Jews and other Americans are unaware of the interaction between Zionism and Hitler and Mussolini. The reason is simple and stark. Now remember, Lenny Brenner is himself a Jewish person who is for the Jewish people. The reason is simple and stark. The Zionist record is dishonorable. This book brings to light, and again he's talking about the top Zionists, or maybe many Zionists who are everyday people who are horrified by this information we're talking about here. I'm sure there are. This book brings to light, through the use of actual historical documents, the disservice that the Zionists did to Jews before and during the Holocaust. Some of these documents were published in English decades ago, but are only now seeing the light of day. Others are being translated into English for the first time. Included are documents from Propaganda Minister Goebbels' newspaper, Der Angriff, detailing an SS man's visit to Palestine as the Zionist guest. Readers will also learn about Adolf Eichmann's account of his personal dealings with the Hungarian Zionist Rezno Katzner. That's the guy in Perfidy by Ben Hecht, who was fingered by the old Jewish guy Martin Grunwald and was found guilty and then assassinated, who was the Secretary of State of Israel in the 50s. Anyway, Eichmann was cooperating with Rezno Katzner, who was later assassinated in Israel as a Nazi collaborator, who betrayed 400,000 Hungarian Jews, also revealed as pro-Zionist propaganda put out by the Nazis, such as a medal for getting Jews to Palestine and a Nazi board game where the object is to move Jews to Palestine. The documents contained in this book were selected with due care so that a rounded picture of history emerges. The author concludes that Zionism betrayed the Jews, and the evidence that led him to that conclusion is contained in this book. This book shows that the consequences of Zionism demand exposure. About the author, Lenny Brenner has authored 3 critically acclaimed books on Jewish history: Zionism in the Age of the Dictators, which we've shown you, The Iron Wall, Zionist Revisionism, from Jablonski to Shamir, and Jews in America Today. He currently resides in New York City, and I even give his email address here somewhere. Okay, let me come to a conclusion. Start to come to a conclusion. Why I think this is so critical. Why I think this is so critical, this information, is because the top Zionist Jews are now using the Holocaust as a brickbat against humanity to accomplish all sorts of things. One is, I think, the United States has given Israel over $100 billion. Germany has given Israel over $50 billion. What I will suggest to you very strongly, based on this evidence, is that just as the average Jewish people in Europe had nothing to do with their rounding up, the killing of many of them, the starvation and the disease that happened near the end of World War II, and so forth, the average German, the average Pole, the average Christian in Europe had nothing to do with the plans for the Holocaust. It was financed, thought of, organized by the top international bankers of both Jewish and non-Jewish. Many of you have probably heard of George Bush, W. Bush's grandfather, or I think it was grandfather Prescott Bush, who was involved in helping to finance and help Hitler up the line. That's in Anthony Sutton's work, I believe. So point is that the average German is and so forth had nothing to do with planning the whole World War II scenario and the so-called Holocaust. I want to talk a little bit about the Holocaust here. What is important to keep in mind here, there may have been many Germans or Poles that got in with guarding the camps or something to try to rise or to go along with the program for their own benefit, but that is not the same as a whole population demanding this happen. Now, the Holocaust, I have to mention briefly here, I look at everything from a theological point of view, and I'm going to put up here another book by Father Dennis Fahey. If one of my friend said to me, the Jewish issue, discussing these things, can be very dangerous for people that don't have a supernatural outlook. So may I strongly recommend that as you delve into these things, you get one of the books by Father Fahey, such as The Kingship of Christ and the Conversion of the Jewish Nation. Fahey is F-A-H-E-Y. And he gives a proper outlook on all these things. I believe, though, that the Hollywood, run, as you can find out in Neil Gabler's book, An Empire of Their Own, founded and run by secularist Jews, they are trying to replace the crucifixion of Christ as the central event in history with the Holocaust, the crucifixion of the Jewish race. Unfortunately, a lot of the facts of the Holocaust, quote-unquote facts, don't hold up. For instance, if anyone wants to come away not believing in gas chambers, and I know that's radical thought for many people, go on the internet, punch in Google David Cole Auschwitz, and I think you'll find on Kodo a 1-hour video you can watch if you have Real Player or some other Windows player or something. The young Jewish guy David Cole, who was on Phil Donahue with a revisionist Bradley Smith in the early 90s, went to Auschwitz, asked questions for an hour, and I don't know how anyone can believe that there were gas chambers at Auschwitz after looking at that thing, looking at that video. The numbers killed at Auschwitz have been reduced in the last 20 years from 4 million to 1 million. There were Jews rounded up, definitely by Hitler. We've told you why. Many were persecuted. David Irving says there were some massacres, but the camps were primarily meant to be a transfer point for Jews to the Middle East, although many Jews were apparently figured to be let die there also. I don't want to minimize that. There were many suffering. These people who say their grandfather, there is an awful lot of survivors, more than one would think, and there's a book out about that now by a Jewish individual named Norman Finkelstein called The Holocaust Industry. I don't know if I could grab it here. The Holocaust Industry by Norman Finkelstein, who at the end has his own mother saying, this came out in the last few years, and I think Finkelstein lost his position at New York City University. He has his mother at the end saying, if everyone who says they are a survivor is, who did Hitler kill? He's making the point of there's so many survivors who are all in excellent health over the last decades. But the point is that while there was Jews rounded up, was Jews killed, there is many problems with the Holocaust story. Hutton Gibson, the father of Mel Gibson, in a recent New York Times magazine article, pointed out the absurdity that 6 million Jews were incinerated in World War II. And of course, that's creating a big controversy. But that was in a few weeks ago, sometime March of 2003, or maybe late February, in a Sunday edition of the New York Times magazine. According to this interview, his wife chimed in, who is his first wife died. This is his second marriage, as it explains in the article, or one of the subsequent articles. Said, well, there weren't even 6 million Jews in Europe at that time, which is also true. So there's many, many problems with the Holocaust story. Michael Hoffman tells us in one of his tapes, the word Holocaust didn't even appear in the dictionary as a capital H until 1980. The Holocaust movie series of 1977 is when the current propaganda that we're facing got started. And today in public schools, almost everything they read has either to do with the Holocaust or slavery. So we want historical accuracy. We want to refute that all of the white Christian descendants of the white Christian nations of Europe need to walk around with a guilt complex for the next from now till eternity, because this just does not fit the facts. What you have is super criminals on all side, the Rothschilds and the Schiffs and the Rockefellers and the more bankers at the top, and Stalin and in Russia, Hitler in Germany, Churchill in England, Roosevelt in the United States, all in my mind super criminals working together, Zionism and Nazism working together in a way that shocks most people, and this is the real side of World War II that puts it all together, and that is the purpose that we tried to bring out in these last few hours with all this documentation. Hitler's motives, he may have, I'm sure he was, many of that his attitudes he expressed of revulsion against the practicing Jews and the Jews, many of whom were pushing pornography in Germany then as they are in America now. I'm sure those they seem to me that those were very sincere convictions of his, but there's more to Hitler than meets the eye. He was amoral, a man who did things that could not be reconciled with a moral man by anybody's standards. So at any rate, we don't know we'll end by how we started here. We don't know who will be madder at this tape. The B'nai B'rith, who wants you to believe that the Nazis and Hitler were out to kill every Jew in the world, which I think we've demonstrably proved is absolutely false, or the Aryan nations, who want you to believe that Hitler should be looked at as a kind of demigod and to be emulated. I think we've absolutely disproved that. Not that the world needed that to be disproved, but we've again disproved that here, that that's absolutely false. So we thank you for watching, and we hope that there will be a much more exhaustive documentation of this subject brought out someday. Thank you very much.